Howdy my totally always tubular gamers, we're back with, you guessed it, another video. Thanks for coming back to the channel. If you're new here, maybe stick around for a while. I got a fun video for you. Today we're going to be doing something retro. I've been talking about new games constantly for the last year plus. Let's talk some retro games. I want to talk about one of my favorite consoles, the N64. Specifically, I want to talk about all of the RareWare games on Nintendo 64. Now, for the uninitiated, the N64, pretty popular console in the 90s, Nintendo's first 3D system, home to so many amazing games, and a lot of those amazing games were developed by Rare. RareWare had been around for a while making games for the NES and Donkey Kong Country on the Super Nintendo, but on the N64, oh, they really peaked, they really hit their stride, and they really put out some amazing games, 11 to be precise. And so for today's video, I thought I would rank them, ranking all 11 of RareWare's games for the N64, worst to best, giving each one of them a little review, stacking them up against each other, seeing how they've aged, are they still fun, and are they still some of the greatest games ever? Well, we're about to find out. And we're going to see which of these games are still worth playing. Spoiler alert, they kind of all are. As always, let me know down below how you're feeling. This is just my opinion. There's a lot of classic games, some of the greatest of all time are on this list, so let me know how you're feeling, if you agree, disagree, or if you think I should have changed my list up, or what you want to see me look at in the future. You can always request down below, but I will mention I prioritize Patreon requests. Speaking of, I do want to give a shout out to Deltex. Thank you very much for the support. I really do appreciate it. And as always, please like, share, comment, subscribe. We got the super thanks and the Patreon. Any support is truly greatly appreciated. If you even made it to this part of the video, you're awesome. So, of these 11 games, which do I think is the weakest? And so here we have Mickey Speedway USA, which released in 2000. Now, Mickey Speedway USA is not the only racing game on the N64 to cover the USA, and it's not the only racing game on the N64 developed by Rare, but in both cases, it is certainly the inferior one. Now, if you somehow couldn't tell by now, this is very much a kart racer in the vein of Mario Kart 64, just with a Mickey and friends coat of paint. There is actually a story to this game. It sees Pluto getting kidnapped by the weasels and Mickey and friends going across, I guess, just all of America looking for Pluto and then racing each other. Yeah, it doesn't make a ton of sense, but I mean, at least they tried. When it comes to the racing itself, this is a pretty standard basic kart racer. Now, the most obvious comparison to this game outside of Mario Kart 64 is Rare's other racing game, Diddy Kong Racing, but there's no planes or hovercrafts here. You are strictly just in the kart, and I'll be real, the kart doesn't feel as nice as Diddy Kong Racing. It controls alright, it feels nice enough, and you do get a decent sense of speed sometimes, but I much prefer the feel and controls of Mario Kart 64 and Diddy Kong Racing, but it's nothing bad, it's just alright. Like Diddy Kong Racing, you collect tokens that will increase your maximum speed, and if you don't have a good amount of tokens, you're not going to go very fast, and yeah, that sense of speed isn't there. There's also items, which isn't exactly a new idea for kart racers, but it's decent enough. They get the job done. They seem somewhat effective. The depth that Diddy Kong Racing had where you upgrade them isn't there, and it certainly feels like they could add one or two more power-ups. Like, I don't know, it just seems a little lacking in the power-ups area. It's fine, but I wouldn't say it's anything very good or memorable. And while on the subject of not very good or memorable, we have really all of the tracks in this game. This is easily the biggest issue with this game, is a lot of the tracks really just aren't very memorable or all that well designed. They're just kind of basic and dull. They're overly simplistic. They don't really seem to do anything all that interesting, and they just come off as kind of generic. There's 20 whole different courses in this game, but I could barely tell you a thing about any of them. They just kind of all blend together, and I feel like none of them did anything particularly all that interesting. Like, by the time I was done with the game, I was barely able to recall any of the tracks I just played through. Call that a bad memory issue? Wouldn't be surprised with how many games I've played, but none of them really stood out to me. Really, this game didn't stand out very much to me. Like, the racing is okay, the tracks are forgettable, the power-ups are kind of whatever, the roster of characters is okay, and it doesn't really feel like this game does anything to stand out from any other racing game that came out around this time. You know, Mario Kart 64 is the fantastic track design and the items, Diddy Kong Racing is 3 different vehicles, Crash Team Racing had the drifting, shoot, even Cruisin' USA, another game where you go across the USA, had a great sense of speed and some pretty decent tracks. This game doesn't really have any of that. It has Mickey and friends, and that's really its biggest selling point, and to be honest, that's really not a huge selling point, especially in this day and age. Like, the game isn't bad, but it's not particularly great either. It's just kind of a mixed bag. At least the presentation is decent, the game is still kind of cute, and you can still have a little bit of fun with it. You can even hook up the Game Boy Color version with the transfer pack, and there's like special things between the two, and there is the Game Boy Color version, which low-key might be better, but at the end of the day, I'd say this game is worth a skip. Like, unless you really love Mickey and Friends, I don't think you're going to get a lot out of it, and I think you should skip it because there are so many other better kart racers that came out during this era. Rare themselves put out one that is way better than this game. It's not a bad game, and I'm sure plenty of people have fond memories with it, but for me, it really is in the middle of the road, pun intended. And so here we have Jet Force Gemini, which came out in 1999. Now, over the years, despite it being re-released a few times, I have just heard less and less about this game, and it seems to be just kind of forgotten, and that's a shame because Jet Force Gemini is actually a pretty decent game, even nowadays. The game is far from a masterpiece or even close to RareWare's best work on the N64, and it does have some pretty serious flaws, but there still is fun to be had with this game. So what is the game even about? It's really about this galactic law enforcement team known as the Jet Force Gemini. It really is composed of two twin siblings, Juno and Vela, and their dog, going up against this evil insectoid Mizar who's been enslaving people and trying to, take them out, and we're not going to have any of that. The story's alright for what it is. Something though that really stands out with this game is just how creative and original it is. Like, all these years later, this game is just beaming with creativity, especially in the character design. The character design is actually very good in this game, I think. When it comes to the presentation, for the most part, I think it is really solid. This is a very good looking N64 game. Unfortunately, the frame rate, especially on original hardware, leaves a lot to be desired, but at least it looks nice and the music is good. And when it comes to the gameplay, there's actually a lot going on here. You're always dropped into these pretty non-linear worlds where you can just freely explore, but what you're doing in them actually varies a bit. There's some 3D platforming. At times it controls like a platformer. There's a good amount of third-person shooting with a bunch of different weapons and enemies to take down. You're almost always doing something different like every hour of the game, and all 15 of the worlds do feel different from each other. You also have two main collectibles, your ship parts and rescuing these tribals. You need to get everything in order to see the last part of this game. And then on top of this, there's actually 3 different characters to play as, the siblings and the dog, and they all have their own unique abilities and do control a little differently. If you asked me what this game primarily is, I would say a third-person shooter. You definitely are in the third-person shooter mode the most, and it's a decent third-person shooter. It controls alright once you get used to the controls, and the shooting is decent. It doesn't feel amazing, none of the weapons pack a serious punch, but yeah, the shooting is decent enough and the combat is okay. The combat itself has honestly aged better than I thought it would. Something that has not really is the controls. The controls in this game, especially if you're playing on original hardware, yeah, it's not great. Like many other N64 games, you have to put some serious time into this game if you want to get accustomed to these controls. They're a bit confusing, and the modern re-releases actually do fix the controls, and it's to the point where I would say if you're at all thinking about playing this game nowadays, play the Rare Replay version or play the Nintendo Switch Online version. The controls are so much better than what the original game had, which was just low-key unintuitive. So I've explained what you're doing in this game, but how is the gameplay? How does it all come together? It comes together actually decently nice. You're exploring these big areas, you're shooting a lot of stuff, you do some platforming, some mini games show up, and you're just trying to save the tribals and find your ship parts. The game has a decent enough pace to it and a nice sense of exploration. You really will need to explore everything though, since you do have to get all of the collectibles if you want to get to the end of the game, which is probably the game's biggest flaw, and it's why I never beat this game as a kid, is because I just couldn't save all of the tribals. They can actually get killed in battle if you accidentally shoot them or if an enemy shoots them, and you'll have to restart the whole level. It's super frustrating when this happens, and I really wish you didn't have to get every single tribal. If you had to get even 90% of them, I think the game would be better. But the game straight up demanding a completionist mentality to beat it is really not the move. That and stealing from charities, but that's a different discussion for a different day. And all of this just makes the game actually get a bit tedious and repetitive at times. The game has a good length to it, taking well over like 10 hours to beat, but if you have to restart these missions over and over and over because they either get killed or you missed one, the game's going to take a lot longer to beat and it's going to get stale real fast. Despite all these flaws, I still think Jet Force Gemini is a good game. It definitely is forgotten these days, but the game has enough good qualities that I could recommend it if you're looking for a different kind of action adventure game from this era, and you probably haven't played this one, so if you're interested at all, you can check it out. It has been re-released, so that is nice. And so here we have Killer Instinct Gold, which came out for the N64 in '96. Now this was originally going to be a launch title for the 64, but was delayed a little bit. The game is essentially a port of Killer Instinct 2, but it does tweak a number of things. I've actually never talked about the Killer Instinct franchise on the channel, and one day I want to go a bit more in depth with this series, so I'll keep things pretty brief. Like I said, the game is basically a port of Killer Instinct 2. Obviously it doesn't look anywhere near as good as Killer Instinct 2 on the arcade, but it looks decent enough, and it plays pretty nice as well. If you've never played Killer Instinct, it isn't too far from Street Fighter or Mortal Kombat. I'd say it's probably a little bit more comparable to Mortal Kombat, more so because of the visuals, but KI does a few things to differentiate itself from Street Fighter and Mortal Kombat. It does have a 6-button setup, 3-punch, 3-kick, and it does have combos, as does every other fighting game where you string together moves, but KI does have auto combos where you're able to enter a certain input and you'll do a nice little combo, and Killer Instinct even has combo breaker where you can interrupt some of the bigger combos, and doing combos is a huge part of KI, like doing these really long strings where you just beat the absolute shit out of people in succession, and it can be incredibly satisfying when you pull off some of these bigger combos. But I will say there is a bit of a learning curve here, especially if you've played like a bunch of other fighting games from this era. This game is going to feel a bit different, not only because KI just has its own unique feel, but a lot of the skill, really almost all of the skill, comes down to memorizing these combo strings and being able to link everything together. More so than the average fighting game where combos don't go on an insanely long time. Here, they can go on stupidly long, and you can just get your absolute ass handed to you if you're playing against somebody that has even a basic understanding of the combo system. In fact, multiple hit combos can even lead to stronger and more brutal attacks, punishing you even further. The game even has finishers, which look awesome, but they also come from the combo system. What I'm trying to get at is if you don't understand the combo system and don't lab it out and practice and memorize these strings, you aren't going to get anywhere. Sure, in the arcade mode against the AI, you'll be just fine, but any other human, yeah, you're going to get your ass beat. And I know there are plenty of people that don't like how Killer Instinct is so combo heavy, how it comes down to just memorizing strings, and you know, I could see why some people don't like that, but I still do find enjoyment in Killer Instinct's gameplay, and think KI Gold is still a pretty solid fighting game. It feels nice, it controls well enough, and it still is fun. You can do some really flashy, cool looking things and feel like an absolute god when you're able to master some of these combos. The game has a decent character selection with some of the coolest characters you'll find in any fighting game, and it has a pretty good soundtrack. In fact, the music is very good in this game. There's also a few extra gameplay modes here that weren't possible with an arcade game, like a tournament mode. So that is pretty cool. Something that definitely stands out to me, especially if you're looking at the footage, is that the character animation isn't amazing. It seems like frames are missing in order to keep the speed up, and you know, I get it, N64 limitations, but it certainly looks a bit funky. But the question is, should you play Killer Instinct Gold, especially nowadays? If you've played any of the other KI games, I think this is worth trying. It is on Rare Replay as well, so there is a modern re-release to play, which is nice. I'd also say, just due to the lack of good fighters on N64, this is probably the best fighting game on N64. I mean, it's either this or like MK Trilogy, so you know the bar is really high here. This is a decent enough fighting game that I've had some fun with over the years, and I think others can have fun with it as well. It's not spectacular, it's not one of the best fighting games ever, but it's still a fun time. And so here we have Donkey Kong 64, which came out in 1999. Now, surprisingly, or maybe not surprisingly, this is Donkey Kong's only 3D game. He's never had one since. It's strictly been in 2D. The game sees the Kongs going up against King K. Rool and his Kremlins. He's got to rescue all of his friends and collect a whole lot of shit. Over the years, Donkey Kong 64 has actually gotten a fair amount of criticism for just being wildly out of control with its collectibles and being extremely bloated. The game is nowhere near as well received as it was when it originally came out, and you know, I can kind of see why. When it comes to the core gameplay, it doesn't play all that different from, say, Banjo-Kazooie, where it is a 3D platformer collectathon, but this game takes the collecting from like Banjo-Kazooie and really cranks it up another notch. Like, despite being a 3D platformer and you doing plenty of platforming, most of the game really is collecting shit. There has never been a game where you collect so much stuff, and it genuinely is comical just how many things you have to collect if you want to beat the game. There are 5 different playable characters, each of them have a bunch of unique things that they collect, and honestly, we would be here all day and night if I explained to you what every single collectible is. I love collecting things in games. Banjo-Kazooie and Tooie, you'll see them later on the list. I love collecting stuff, but this game, it just takes it way too far. You really just have to collect too much stuff, and way too much of it is specific to one Kong. So if you're the wrong Kong in an area, you have to go back to the character switching pad, then go back, and it just creates this really tedious loop that very easily could have been avoided if you could just switch Kongs on the fly. The game would take nowhere near as long, it would not feel as tedious, and it wouldn't be as bloated either. Like, you'll spend hours upon hours exploring every single nook and cranny as every single Kong if you want to get everything. 100% in this game is just out of the question. Do not do it. Many people have have, many people have attempted, don't even bother. Just collect what you absolutely have to collect and move on, otherwise you will be here forever. And it's a shame too, because I actually think the level design is really solid in this game. It's some of the best Rare has ever done. They're really able to do some dynamic stuff with 5 different playable characters, and I really enjoy just how different all of the Kongs are from each other. They all play completely differently, they have their own unique abilities. I think it's really cool. And I think the game even has some pretty decent bosses. They're all really easy, but at least they're a good spectacle, and I really do love the final boss. The presentation is very good. The game looks great. It uses that N64 expansion pack, so it better look good, and it does. And the music is very iconic. It is very much that RareWare N64 music, and I love it. The game actually has a lot going for it still. The controls are nice. The gameplay for the most part is nice. It's just really bogged down by all the collecting and then the mini games. Oh, these mini games can just fuck right off. As a kid, I hated these mini games. They're challenging, they don't control well, and they're just annoying, man. I hated them then. I don't like them now. The mini games can just straight up piss off. Luckily, you don't have to do most of them, so you can avoid some of the really bad ones. Now, overall, I know I've been a bit all over the place, and that's because I just kind of feel all over the place with Donkey Kong 64. It is a bit of a mixed bag. At the end of the day, I probably would still recommend it, but it would certainly be one of those approach with caution games. If you like 3D platformers or you like Donkey Kong and you haven't tried it, I do think it is worth playing, but it clearly is not for everybody. And if you're someone who doesn't love to collect, and I mean collect a lot of stuff, then the game's probably not going to be for you. It still is a good game. It's just, yeah, you got to know what you're getting into with this one. It still is a classic, but it's certainly a mixed classic, in my opinion. And so here we have GoldenEye 007, which came out in 1997. Now, I am sure it doesn't really matter where I put this game on the list, someone's going to be disappointed, and so I'm just going to say, while GoldenEye was a revolutionary first-person shooter, it helped popularize first-person shooters on consoles, and has some fantastic multiplayer that's even gold nowadays, pun intended. The game has not exactly aged well. It is not all that great to come back to this game. And it's sadly one of those games that as time goes on, it just kind of gets worse and worse. I still think it's a good game. I still, again, am not going to downplay just how significant it was for the genre and games as a whole. Like, it was extremely impactful. It's just, if you come back to this game in current year and you've never played it before, I don't know how much you're going to like it. At the very least, it is widely accessible and it has been re-released, and those newer versions have much better controls than what the original version had and just a much cleaner image. But the single player itself, I don't know, I've just never really been all that big on it. The multiplayer has always been good. I played this game when I was younger, I've played it nowadays, I've always had a great time in the multiplayer. It really is excellent. The single player though, not so much. The game does follow the movie, although it clearly does take some liberties, and it may even make up a scenario or two that didn't happen, but it tries to follow the movie, and you know, it gets all the important points. So as a movie tie-in game, yeah, I think it absolutely nails that, but a lot of these missions are all over the place. Some of them are good, some of them are pretty straightforward, where you just kind of shoot everything and move forward. Other ones you get various objectives where you need to look for specific things, or you got to rescue hostages. There's even an escort mission or two, and you got to use 007's gadgets. And depending on the difficulty you play on, it will affect your objectives. On harder difficulties, you get even more objectives, and I'll be real, not all missions are created equal. When it comes to the combat itself, like the shooting and the gunplay, I think it's decent enough. Obviously, it has aged, it doesn't feel amazing, and it takes a bit of time to get used to, but it's not exactly unplayable. It's not absolutely awful. It's just, yeah, it's aged and it's not great, but I mean, it gets the job done. Eventually, you will get used to it. What I think really hasn't aged all that well is these objectives. When it's straightforward, it's relatively fine. It's when it's not straightforward is when I get really frustrated. Some of these objectives are just so almost obtuse. You'll be exploring around these low poly areas looking for very specific things, or having to interact with a very specific object or part of the world, and it's just not super clear. And a lot of this game was just me looking around going, what do I do? Where do I go? Let me get the walkthrough out, because I just don't really understand what I'm supposed to do in these areas. And I'm sure there'll be people that'll go, skill issue, can't figure it out, he just sucks at the game. All these years later, man, I still have trouble figuring out what the hell I'm supposed to do in some of these areas. And then some of the missions are just not very well designed, where you just take on an onslaught of guards, and then then you have to try to figure out what to do on top of that. And the game just doesn't explain some of its systems very well, like the stealth air quote system where it's just karate chopping people in the back. Like, the game doesn't explain this, or how like any of the gadgets work and where you need to use them, and it just adds even further confusion. And lastly, the game can actually get pretty punishing. Like, there's no checkpoints, there's no way to actually recover health. You can find body armor, but the game gets rather difficult, especially on the harder difficulties. Like, you'll be replaying these levels over and over and over, and it just gets rather tedious. It's not fun. Like, straight up, I didn't have a lot of fun with many of these missions because I was just kind of frustrated. I was like, where do I go? What do I do? How the hell does any of this work? Why can't I just go shoot more bad guys? I mean, call me a simpleton for just wanting to shoot more bad guys, but the most fun I had with this game was when I was just shooting everything, doing these objectives, interacting with these more complex systems. I just don't think they're all that well designed, or implemented for that matter. But most people seem to forget all of that's even in the game. They just remember the amazing multiplayer, and you know, fair enough, the multiplayer is pretty awesome. It is still really fun to come back to, and we can at the very least all agree that the music is goated. The music is legendarily good. It is just absolutely fantastic. The music just slaps every single level. It is crazy good. I love the music to death. And so in conclusion, is GoldenEye even worth playing nowadays? I think GoldenEye is worth trying just for the history alone, especially trying the multiplayer. That's still good, but playing the actual single player all the way through, I don't know about that. I just don't care for a majority of the missions, and I think that some of them are just outright terrible. The controls and the shooting certainly have aged. The presentation, especially the frame rate, was just never very good. And hopefully I've kind of explained why I feel like GoldenEye is a little bit of a mixed bag. There are certain things I really do love about this game, and there are certain things I don't love about this game. I'm not coming in here to try to be like, I'm a new school gamer, I hate old games, this game sucks because it's old. No, I love retro games, I love old games, I regularly talk about old games. I just have never loved GoldenEye, you know, call it one of my hottest takes, but I've never thought this game was all that. And I've always just been a little confused when some people call it one of the very greatest N64 games or shooters of all time. Some of the best multiplayer in a video game ever? Absolutely, but anything else? Not in my opinion. And here we have Blast Corps, which came out in '97. Now, Blast Corps is pretty different from all the other games Rare made on the 64, and even nowadays, it's a pretty unique game in general. So the setup to this game is decently interesting. It takes place on some kind of like parallel Earth, and everything seems to be pretty peaceful until the government discovers that 2 defective nuclear missiles that were being delivered have started leaking radiation. And because of this, the automated carrier transporting them becomes all jacked up and starts going directly towards the controlled detonation site. And instead of, you know, finding a nice safe route to the controlled detonation site, it really is just going to go straight towards it. It's going to make a beeline to it, and if this thing bumps into literally anything, it's going to go off. A nuclear explosion is going to go off, and so they call in the Blast Corps, who come in to destroy everything that is in the missile's path. And that's really what the gameplay is as well. The missile is constantly going to the detonation site, and you have to get rid of everything in its way. Whether it's buildings, big or small, monuments, it does not matter. You have to get everything out of the way as it tries to get to the detonation site, and it really is as fun as it sounds. The entire game really is you just destroying like everything in its way. There's several different vehicles you can choose between, and they all behave differently and destroy stuff in different ways, and a big part of the gameplay is switching between these and knowing which vehicle to use for which scenario, and it actually leads to some puzzles. The game is not just as straight up mindless as it seems. There actually is a bit of depth here, really knowing which vehicles to use to destroy everything and making sure the path is clear uses more brain power than you'd imagine. There are a few other objectives that show up here, but most of the game really is destroying everything. But it's cool that there's some variety. After you beat a mission, you can actually free roam in the area to get some more points, and there's a time attack mode, so there is actually some replayability with this one. Despite seeming incredibly simple, and you know it is to an extent, this game actually does have some complexity, which is nice, and you will have to think for a few levels about which vehicle to use, and all of this leads to just some of the most unique gameplay you'll find not only on the N64 but in general. Why aren't there more games like this? This seems like such an easy, fun idea. I mean, who doesn't love just destroying everything and then throw in a few puzzle elements? Like, this just seems like a smash hit, pun intended, and it is. The game is actually incredibly fun. The presentation is great. It's got some solid music and the visuals are nice, and I love this game's attitude and just vibe. It's got a really fun vibe to it. It doesn't take itself way too serious. I mean, it's a pretty stupid concept and the game just runs with it. Like many other Rare games at the time, it has charm, personality, and a little bit of an attitude. And so you might be wondering, why is it only at this part of the list if you think it's so good? I do have a few little flaws with it. The camera can be pretty awkward at times. The controls, like many other N64 games, take a bit of time to get used to. Even with the modern re-release, it just takes a minute to get used to the controls, and I think the other games ahead of it just are a little bit better. But don't discount Blast Corps. It still is a good game, it still is worth playing, and it's just a fun-ass, unique experience that I think is worth your time. And so here we have Perfect Dark, which came out in 2000. Now, Perfect Dark is the spiritual successor to GoldenEye, and in my opinion, this game does not get gassed up nearly as much as GoldenEye does, and that's a shame because in my opinion, it's a much better game than GoldenEye. Sure, it doesn't have the 007 license, it doesn't have the cool James Bond, and it doesn't have the same atmosphere that GoldenEye had, but I think this game is just a straight up improvement over GoldenEye in so many aspects. The game takes place in an alternate 2023 where AI is totally taking over. Okay, maybe this isn't alternate 2023, but there is two alien races going to war, and Earth is kind of caught in the middle. You play as Joanna Dark, an agent of this institute, who is really given some discrete missions, and that's all I'm going to say for the story, because the story and the world and the characters of Perfect Dark are actually pretty good. I love Joanna, she's a great protagonist, and the world of Perfect Dark is very interesting. It's different, it's original, and the game goes kinda out there. I like it. I like the world they create in Perfect Dark, and I hope one day in the future, if that new game ever comes out, they really expand on this world even further. Now, when it comes to the gameplay, it plays very similarly to GoldenEye, but it makes a bunch of additions and improvements to make this, in my opinion, much better than GoldenEye. I will just immediately off the bat say that when it comes to the multiplayer, it is just as good, if not better than GoldenEye's. Everything you loved about GoldenEye's multiplayer is here outside of Odd Job. Like, it's just total carnage. You can control basically every single aspect of the multiplayer. You can make it absolutely batshit insane, and it's still some of the best multiplayer on the console. Now, when it comes to the single player, this is really where things are much more improved than GoldenEye. Straight up, the missions are way better in this game. In my opinion, they are way better designed. It's much more obvious what you're supposed to do. The shooting is better, and it's just aged better in general. When it comes to the combat and the gunplay, I think it's way better than GoldenEye's. It feels a lot nicer. It's a lot smoother, tighter. The weapons feel nicer. When it comes to the other systems, like the gadgets and just how some of the systems work, the game actually tries to explain it to you. And I actually did understand how most of it worked. Granted, I did play this after GoldenEye where it was just kind of trial by fire, but I at least thought the other systems made a little sense. When it comes to the level design, I think it's a lot better than GoldenEye's. It's tighter, it's smoother, it's easier to go through, and the objectives are just a bit more obvious what you're supposed to do. You're given more info, it's just a lot clearer what is necessary for you to do, and depending on the difficulty, more objectives will be added, and you're not going to catch me playing on the harder difficulties. There were still plenty of parts where I went, I don't really understand what I'm supposed to do, and I had to look it up, but it was far less than GoldenEye's, and I just really enjoyed myself a lot more while playing through this game. I guess it really just clicked with me, and GoldenEye just never, unfortunately, did. I also think the game is a little easier. It doesn't feel as punishing as GoldenEye did. Like, don't get it twisted, this game has some hard-ass moments and hard levels to it, but it never felt as difficult as frickin' GoldenEye's missions got. And again, I just had more fun with it. You can even play the entire game cooperatively. That's pretty cool, and the frame rate's actually stable for the most part. The re-releases are also good. The game looked good then, it looks nice now. The soundtrack is also really great. I don't know if it's as good as GoldenEye's, probably not, but it is still very good. This really is, in my opinion, the best first-person shooter on the 64, and the game that is absolutely worth playing. If you like older first-person shooters, you really should try this one. And so here we have Conker's Bad Fur Day, which came out in 2001. Now, I'll just immediately put it out there, this is one of my favorite games of all time. I absolutely love this game to pieces. Ever since I first played it when I was younger, I just fell in love with it. I've played through it several times over, including the remake a few times. Like, I really do love this game. But I'm also self-aware enough to realize that this game, it isn't a masterpiece, and there are plenty of flaws with it. Despite that though, I still think it is a really great game. When it comes to the story, it is very unique from all other Rare games. It sees you play as Conker the Squirrel, and you're in this really cutesy, friendly world that absolutely looks like it was ripped out of Banjo-Kazooie, where everything's got the cartoony eyeballs, everyone's smiling, and it looks like a Disney cartoon. But there's a huge twist. The game is actually rated M. It is very mature, it is vulgar, it is nasty, and it is funny as hell. Like, the tone and the atmosphere of Conker's Bad Fur Day is so unique. Like, it very much has that cutesy, friendly vibe to it, and then just some violent shit happens, like someone gets maimed and there's blood and guts everywhere, or there's just piss and shit all over the place. You fight a giant talking poop, you throw toilet paper at him, Conker gets drunk and pees all over the place. There's these like Nazi teddy bears, and honestly, we could be here all day talking about how much wild shit is in this game. It was wild then, it's still wild now. The game's tone, its atmosphere, its premise, its story, its characters, it is hilarious. It is really different from any other N64 game, and it's just great. It's fantastic. I love it so much. Call me a little immature, but I love this game's references and the parodies and the jokes, the humor in general. I love all the piss and shit, and I really can appreciate that the game does not let go of the gas. It is wild pretty much from the beginning, and it only gets crazier and crazier to have a really explosive ending. Like, the game's story and characters make the game worth playing by itself. You don't even need to factor in the gameplay. And one of the main reasons all of this is so great is the presentation is just phenomenal. For an N64 game, it doesn't get like any better than this. This is like the best sounding, best looking N64 game of them all. The game looks great. It looks good nowadays. There's so much charm and personality with the presentation, and I just love the aesthetic. The voice acting is also really great. A lot of N64 games don't have any voice acting. In fact, a majority of them don't. This game is full of voice acting though, and it's all very good. The writing is also pretty great. The game is funny, and the story's really all over the place. I don't want to spoil a single thing. I'll just say, really do enjoy the story and the writing along with that voice acting. And the music, oh, it's so good. It's legendary stuff. Legit, it is really, really well done. Alright, let's actually talk about the video game now. So when it comes to Conker's Bad Fur Day, I'd say it's primarily a 3D platformer, but there are plenty of other things you'll do in this game. When it comes to the controls and the feel, I think it's fine for what it is. It's not amazing, but it controls decent enough, and Conker is relatively responsive. He has a few unique moves, but it's nothing too crazy. What really makes the gameplay crazy is the context-sensitive stuff. You'll regularly find these pads or platforms where you'll press the context-sensitive button, and Conker will do something that, as the title implies, is context-sensitive. Sometimes it's goofy stuff, like he'll pull out a little slingshot and you'll shoot it at some bees. Another time he'll pull out a flamethrower and start torching bats, or one time he'll just get drunk and start peeing all over the place. It really depends on the context. And then on top of this, there's a bunch of sequences and sections of this game where you're doing something totally different. One part you're on a hoverboard, one time you get turned into a bat and you're shitting on things, sometimes it's a third-person shooter. The game actually has a lot of different gameplay styles and variety, to the point where I'd say not even half of the game is a platformer. You do platforming more than anything else, but there's just a lot of different types of gameplay here, and I'll be the first to admit not all of it is good. Some of it is good, some of it's actually pretty fun. I like when you're racing on the hoverboards, even if it is super punishing. I like when you're the bat flying around shitting on things, and I think all of the boss fights are great. The boss fights might be the highlight of the entire game, but some sections of this game just absolutely suck. Anytime you are underwater, it is awful. And pretty much the entire war section of the game isn't very good, whether you're pushing the poopy porta potty bomb guy, the firefights with the teddies, and going through their labs. When you're in the tank, the boss fight isn't even all that good in this area. The war section of the game is my least favorite part of the game, but it's not awful, it's just not as good as the rest of the game. And the same kind of goes for the controls. You know, at times the controls are totally fine, like when you're running around as Conker, but during some of these sequences, like the third person shooting, or when you're in the tank, the controls just aren't that responsive or good. They're not absolutely awful, but yeah, they're not great. At the very least, the campaign is incredibly varied. You're always doing something different. No two parts of the game are even remotely similar to each other. It has a decent length to it. It's able to stay interesting the entire time. And the game has a really great multiplayer that is like severely underrated. I love the multiplayer to this game, and it makes me sad that barely anybody ever even talks about it. And then the remake straight gutted it for some generic shooter. Now, despite the game having some issues and some pretty poorly designed areas, I absolutely think this game is 100% worth playing. It is one of the funniest, most creative, wacky games you will ever play. Even if you don't really like platformers, I'd still recommend it because, again, like not even half of the game is platforming. You do so much shit in this game that is just all over the place. I really do think it is worth playing. It is one of those must-play experiences just for how wild and creative it gets. It is widely available. Thanks to Rare Replay, seriously, Rare Replay might be the only reason I even still have my Xbox One, and the game was remade, but I don't really recommend the remake for a few reasons I'm not going to get into today. This game, though, very much worth playing. And so here we have Diddy Kong Racing, which came out in 1997. Now, Diddy Kong, he had been around the block before. People knew who he was. He was the main star of Donkey Kong Country 2. But he got his own spin-off, and not only did he get just a spin-off, he got a kart racer. And what he got is one of the greatest kart racers of them all. Maybe the best racing game on the N64. I'm serious, Mario Kart 64 can get on out of here. This is a Diddy Kong Racing household. But seriously, I have a lot of love for this game. So it actually does have a story, you know. Diddy and his friends are just trying to, I guess, have a party, hang out, racing some cars, but this evil alien wizard thing known as Whiz-Pig shows up to interrupt everything, and it's up to everyone to stop him. Something Diddy Kong Racing had that very few other racing games at the time had was like a full-on story mode, a real adventure mode where you're dropped into this hub and you'll go between the areas and do a bunch of events. There's even a main collectible, these balloons, which are needed to progress forward. And this very easily could have been a menu like so many other games, but I've always loved that you really do just get to explore around in this little open area, and sure, it is a little barren, but the novelty is absolutely there. On top of this, the game does have, you know, just straight up Grand Prix and time trial and multiplayer modes that you'd expect from a kart racer, but this adventure mode is really where I've spent most of my time. And it really is one of the greatest single player modes of any kart racer. Like, all these years later, this single player is still really great. When it comes to the character roster, you have Diddy Kong, and then you have a bunch of other cutesy friendly characters that are all very charming, and they all do play relatively different from each other. Some characters are a lot more balanced, some are focused on speed, some are focused on turning. I've always preferred just the more balanced characters, but I think the driving is pretty good. Let's get into the driving itself. So the big thing about Diddy Kong Racing is there are 3 modes of transportation. There is the kart racing, where it certainly is a bit more traditional, especially when it comes to the handling. You can even drift, but then you have the hovercrafts where there is no drifting, but you can hop around, you can go on water, ice, etc. And you even get to fly in a plane, and flying in the plane has always been my favorite. It's really fun. It actually feels nice. You can do some really big turns. There's a bunch of boost pads for all 3 of these, and the driving, the handling actually feels really good for all of them. It's really easy to pick up and understand, but it definitely takes a little bit of time to master, and it's really great that there's 3 different modes of transportation, and they're all equally good. There's no bad one here. They didn't just like favor one and throw the other 2 in there. No, they're all actually good. They're all viable, and the tracks really are set up for each vehicle. And the tracks in general are really great. They're a standout when it comes to this game. One of the best aspects of this game. There really is like no bad track here. I love all of them. They're all really well designed, and they all feel different from each other. There's some really great ones here that are some of my favorite tracks in any kart racer, especially towards the end of the game. I really love some of these. These tracks, I really got nothing but praise for them. And to keep that praise going, we have the game's presentation. It looks pretty great for an N64 game. It looks nice nowadays. I love just the aesthetic of this game and the vibe. It has just such a charming and cute atmosphere to it. Yeah, there are stakes, but they're so low key that it's not like world altering, and I just really appreciate the vibe this game has going on. And the soundtrack is fantastic. The soundtrack is one of Rare's best. Like, I really do love the soundtrack to Diddy Kong Racing. I love a lot of things about this game, but there are a few things I don't love. There are a few events that aren't racing that show up here, like collecting the coins, and these are a pain in the ass, and I've never been huge on these. Like having to explore the area just to find all the coins, then restarting it and trying to get all the coins and come in first place, man, this has always been just not very good. Like, it's a cool concept and it takes advantage of the fact that Rare loves their collectibles, but I just don't think it really suits this game. And the bosses, I could kind of take them or leave them. I know some people love them, but I've just never been huge on them. I like that each track is set up specifically for the boss and you only race the boss, but man, these boss fights were hella hard as a kid, and I just really have never been big on them now. They seem a little cheap and at times a little punishing. In fact, this game occasionally has some odd difficulty spikes, but it's nothing too crazy, and if you just retry a few times, you'll be just fine. At the end of the day, Diddy Kong Racing is a fantastic game that I have zero problem recommending. It was remade for the DS, which was always an odd choice, but that is all Microsoft nonsense. You know, speaking of Microsoft nonsense, that's probably why we haven't gotten the game re-released, since Banjo and Conker are in it, and those are Microsoft characters. I hope in the future it comes to Nintendo Switch Online. That's really the best we can hope for. But regardless, doesn't really matter how you play it now, I absolutely do recommend this game. It's just one of my favorite racers ever. And so you knew it was coming. Here we have Banjo-Kazooie, released in 1998, maybe Rare's magnum opus. It is one of the games they are famous for developing, and for good reason. Banjo-Kazooie really is one of those absolute instant classics, must-play 3D platformers that I have no problem just immediately recommending to everybody. But to review the game a little bit, the game sees Banjo the bear and Kazooie the Breagle just hanging out in their house sleeping when Banjo's sister Tooie gets kidnapped by Grunty the witch. See, Gruntilda wants to be the prettiest of them all, and Tooie, I guess, is prettier than Grunty. Sorry, Grunty. You just aren't the most attractive, and she knows this because she's going to try to steal Tooie's energy, youth, attractiveness, man, I don't know. She's going to try to take Tooie's energy so she becomes good looking, and so Banjo and Kazooie have to go rescue her. Pretty simple plot, and really isn't anything special, but Banjo-Kazooie is just such a mystical, childlike wonder world that I absolutely adore. I love this game's vibe, its aesthetic, the characters, the look. I really just love everything to do with that. Everything from the world to the characters to the environments, it's all incredibly charming, and it just has such a great personality. Like, the game just oozes personality in every single aspect, and it makes coming back to this game even more fun than it actually is, because I just love seeing the characters and the world of Banjo-Kazooie. But the gameplay is also very good. The game is a relatively run-of-the-mill open 3D platformer collectathon where you're dropped into these relatively large areas and told to just go collect things. The main collectible is the Jiggies, these puzzle pieces. And there's 10 for every single world, and it's up to Banjo and Kazooie to figure out how they're going to get all 10 of them. Some of them are through platforming challenges. Some of them you have to help out a character. Sometimes you even got to play a mini game. Really, almost every single Jiggy is different, at least to obtain, and collecting these has always been a blast. Something that makes Banjo-Kazooie as good as it does is the levels. The levels really carry this entire game. All 10 levels are fantastic. There is not a bad level here. They are all very different from each other. They all have different characters. They all have different challenges. They all keep you interested and engaged, and they're just so different from each other to the point where they're all extremely memorable. And what you do in all of these levels are very memorable. Whether you're just doing some platforming and you find a Jiggy, whether you're helping out a character like Tip Top and you're helping his little melody, or you're helping out the giant fish Clanker get some air, or it's one of the game's many transformations, you transform into something really every level, and all of these are different. They all have unique abilities, and you can get a Jiggy or two thanks to the transformations. And while there are other collectibles outside of the Jiggy, none of them are as important really as the Jiggy, and the collectibles don't go overboard. There isn't too many of them. It's very manageable and understandable, and I wouldn't be here all day explaining all of them. And I've always really enjoyed collecting things in this game, whether it was my first time, my 5th time, or now my 10th time collecting everything. It is just so much fun to collect everything in Banjo-Kazooie. The game is just whimsical, it's low-key magical, as corny as that sounds, and it just really never fails to impress. It's also incredibly replayable, as you can get the Jiggies in totally different orders. You don't have to get every single one to beat the game. And there's also some secrets here and there that you can get, like the stop and swap eggs, which are pretty cool. Something else that helps this game world really stand out is the presentation. I mean, look at it. It looks like that typical N64 game, but man, I just love the look of this game. I think it looks great. It runs incredibly well, especially the re-releases. The re-releases are really great. And if you're going to play this game at all, I really do recommend the Xbox re-releases. Like, these are just fantastic and easily the definitive way to play these games, especially because it actually saves the notes. Like, when you collect the notes, you've collected it, you're good. In the original game, it actually did not save it. It would only save like the total amount you got, and if you went back to the level, you have to collect them all, and that was always a minor issue. Anyway, I'm getting off topic here. The Xbox version is the definitive way to play this game. It looks the best, it runs incredibly well, the music is goated, it's fantastic, nobody's going to deny that. The presentation really is top notch. The gameplay is some of the best gameplay you'll find in any platformer. This game has always been one of those must play games in my opinion. I don't really care if you don't like platformers or games of this style. I think you'll enjoy parts of this game. It's so friendly, it's cute, it's easy to pick up and understand, but exploring the worlds, collecting the Jiggies, man, this is peak gameplay. I know it sounds silly, but I absolutely love this game to death. It is aged incredibly well, and it's still very, very easy to come back to. The controls have aged well. It feels really nice. None of the objectives are really obtuse. The minigames aren't total shit, and they're not just thrown in for the sake of it. They're actually well implemented. I like really almost every single aspect of this game. I do wish that we could replay sections or areas. That's something I have always wanted. That and call it a hot take, but I've never really liked the furnace fun either. I mean, it's funny, the writing is good in this game. This game has a great sense of humor, but the furnace fun, yeah, never been a big fan of that. But these are minor issues. Like, I really could not imagine somebody playing Banjo-Kazooie and going, yeah, I hate this sucks. Like, then I'd go, what do you like? Yeah. Zero problems recommending the game. Really is one of the greatest 3D platformers ever. And then we have Banjo-Tooie, which came out in 2000. Now, I'm pretty sure there's been a debate really since Tooie came out of whether or not people prefer Kazooie or Tooie. As a kid, I always preferred Kazooie, but as I've gotten older, I've really come to prefer Banjo-Tooie and believe it's one of the greatest 3D platformers ever made. And when it comes to Rare's games, I don't think it gets any better than Banjo-Tooie. It really is the pinnacle for me. I can absolutely see why somebody would say they prefer Kazooie to Tooie. I mean, I was there myself, and I don't disagree with you that in many aspects Kazooie is better, but Tooie overall is my favorite game, and I believe it's one of the very best N64 games, period. The game really just absolutely expands on everything that made Kazooie great, and really takes it to the next level. I know there are plenty of people that don't like the direction that Tooie took for several different aspects, but I'm in the camp that very much is into it. Okay, but let's actually talk about the game. The game is a sequel to Kazooie, and it sees Grunty coming back as a bunch of bones from the first game. Her sisters show up to come and help her and basically say, hey, if you want to get your body back, you basically have to suck the life out of the world, and yeah, it's up to Banjo and Kazooie to stop her. When it comes to the story, it's a lot darker and more serious than the first game. The stakes are considerably higher, and the game really just has a much more serious overtone to it. When it comes to the tone and atmosphere, it definitely has a different tone from that first game. That first game was really charming and cutesy and friendly. This one, it's a bit more serious, it's darker, it's got some edge to it, and I actually really like it. I love the original game's whimsical tone and atmosphere, but I like that they really went for something darker and different here. And the game is still very funny. The game still has a really great sense of humor, and the writing is still great. It's just got a much darker overtone. And the same really can be said for the vibe and the atmosphere. It just feels different from that original game. It's not bad, just different and a bit more serious. When it comes to the gameplay though, it isn't all that different from the original game. You still get dropped into these massive worlds and really are told to just go collect the Jiggies, but collecting these Jiggies are a lot more involved than the first game. In the first game, you know, a lot of them you really just found in the environment by exploring. Here, you usually have to do something for someone. Usually you either have to do something, you gotta transform into something in order to get the other ones, or you gotta collect something else to then get the Jiggy. There's just a lot more moving parts when it comes to collecting these. There's a few other collectibles as well. And there really is just more depth when it comes to the collecting in this game. There isn't a ton of things to collect. It's not overkill like Donkey Kong 64. It's just getting everything is going to take a bit of work, unlike the original where, yeah, a lot of stuff was just kind of hidden in plain sight, or you could just do a little bit of platforming and go find it. There's plenty of platforming here. It's just you have to do a lot of things for a lot of characters, and that means a lot of different styles of gameplay. There's actually several different types of gameplay and mini games that show up, and these are obviously way better than Donkey Kong 64's and are a lot more fleshed out, and I think they actually add a lot of variety. I really do like almost all of these. There's really not a bad one here. Some are clearly better than others, but I wouldn't say any of the mini games are bad, and I would still say they are welcome. Even the first-person shooter parts, I actually always liked these as a kid, and even nowadays, yeah, I like it, even if some of them are really challenging. And yeah, getting some of these Jiggies are challenging. It's not as straightforward as the original game, and you might even need a walkthrough for a few of them. There's even some Jiggies that span multiple worlds. All of these worlds are very connected to each other, and sometimes you'll do something that will affect something else in a totally different level, and I always really enjoyed these. I really love how it just feels like this big, open, interconnected world. It kind of feels like it was a little bit ahead of its time. It's one of the cooler aspects in my opinion. It just shows that getting these Jiggies, yeah, it really is a lot more complex. There's even backtracking that shows up. Like the first game, you learn plenty of new abilities, and sometimes you get an ability way later in the game. You can go back to one of those earlier areas and get a Jiggy that you had no idea on how to get. And something that's really cool is you actually get to keep your moveset from the original game. Yeah, in the original Banjo-Kazooie, they learn a bunch of new moves. Here, you start with all of them. You get a bunch of new moves though, so like your moveset is just greatly expanded. You really just have this like arsenal of moves to use. I mean, you can even split Banjo and Kazooie up, and I think there's some really great puzzles that involve both of them. Getting the Jiggies, it's clear here, is just a lot more complex than what the original game had, and I know some people don't like that it's more complex. and would prefer the more straightforward, somewhat simplistic style of the original game, and I absolutely get it. The original game has its merits, but when it comes to me personally, I actually like how complex it gets, and I really enjoy collecting almost all of the jiggies. Now when it comes to the levels, the original game, not a bad level at all. Banjo-Tooie though, I cannot say the same. While I think there are some fantastic levels in this game, there is one in particular that I do not like. It's like my biggest connotation with this entire game, and that is Grunty Industries. I do not like this level. I've never liked it, and every time I come back to it, I really try to avoid this level and most of the jiggies because I just don't have fun with this level. It's too complex, it's too confusing, it's unintuitive, I don't like the transformation, I really just don't like much about this level. Something else I'm not huge on in this game is the boss fights. While they are kind of a cool spectacle similar to DK64, they are just way too easy, to the point that you got the whole squad laughing at them. They are just an absolute joke. Outside of Mr. Patches is a fantastic boss fight. He's the best boss fight in maybe the entire Banjo-Kazooie series, that or the final boss of the original. Mr. Patches is great, and his music is great as well. Speaking of the presentation and the music, oh, it's fantastic, especially the later re-releases that really fixed the frame rate. That original N64 version, the frame rate was shit. Like proper shite, but the re-release, yeah, it really fixes up the frame rate. It's super smooth, the game looks great, it runs great, and the music, oh, I love the music to Banjo-Tooie. Is it as good as Kazooie's? I don't know about that, but it is still really great. I do enjoy the music of this game, the vibe, the atmosphere, the presentation, all of that is great. Banjo-Tooie, really, like Kazooie, is one of my favorite games of all time, and really it just kind of comes down to personal preference whether you like Tooie or Kazooie more. I love Tooie just a tiny bit more, even with shitty Grunty Industries. Many of the other levels absolutely slap though, like Witchy World. Ooh, Witchy World is my favorite level in the entire franchise, and it's right here in Banjo-Tooie. There's not a bad jiggy there. That's a fantastic one. Almost all of the mini games are pretty fun, and at the very least, I think we can all agree that Stop and Swap was handled a lot better in Tooie than in Kazooie. That we can agree on, right? Anyway, that's it for this video. I'm going to wrap things up. I'm sure plenty of people are going to disagree with my choice. I know not everybody loves Tooie as much as Kazooie. At the end of the day, I got to talk about a lot of my favorite games. It was fun to do something retro. Let me know down below if this is what you want to see going forward. I might take a little break from the modern stuff. And I hope everyone has a fantastic night, day, evening, whatever the hell is closest to. If you made it to this part of the video, I need you to comment cement, as in what's in the building and the ground. That's, you know, a little code word. You made it to the end of the video, you will get a heart from me. I promise. I love you. All right, now, I'll see y'all later. Bye-bye.